ecology related.
Just so everyone knows, I just turned the recording on for the workshop. Um, and I'm going to get started as people start to filter in. Um, I'm mostly just doing the introduction for new entries, so you won't miss anything if you come in now or as I'm doing this. Today's workshop is called Climate Recordkeeping Sensitivity and Competitive Analysis. Uh, New Entry Sustainable Farming Project is the host for this. I work for New Entry. My name is Emily. I'm the technical assistance manager here, and you can reach me at emily.round@tufts.edu if you need anything or have any questions about the workshop afterwards. And for introductions and tech check, please rename yourself, add your pronouns if you'd like to your name. Add to the chat your name, your pronouns, your farm name, and where you're located so we can kind of get to know each other. It's always nice to see where everyone's coming from. Please mute yourself until the Q&A session at the end. And if you have any questions as we're going along, add them to the chat and we can work on getting them answered. Sessions are recorded. Video is optional, but we prefer video to be on just because we love to see your lovely faces. So a little bit about New Entry. Our mission is to improve our local and regional food systems by training the next generation of farmers. And we encourage them to make food that is sustainable, nutritious, culturally appropriate, and accessible to all individuals. We are located in Beverly, Massachusetts on ancestral, traditional, contemporary, and unceded lands. And we serve Essex and Middlesex counties, so mostly the northeastern part of Massachusetts. And sometimes our range goes a little bit outside of that with our farmers who have graduated our programs, sometimes going to Western Mass, New Hampshire, Southern Massachusetts, and all around. There's a lot of different sections to what New Entry does. We have farmer training programs, we have Food Hub, and we also have a National Incubator Farm Initiative. Tonight's workshop is part of the farmer training programs. We do lots of courses, workshops, and we also have an incubator farm. Of the workshops, tonight we're working on a record-keeping workshop. On our incubator farm, we give technical assistance to new farmers on a quarter acre to an acre of land, access to equipment, and access to markets through our food hub. One of the courses that's coming up is our crop production course, which is an 8-week-long online workshop starting in spring 2024. It's online and there is some in-person components on the farm, so you get some hand-on experience. And you'll learn about production with our 3/4 acre demonstration plot and also at a larger field scale. Topics in this course include soil conservation, weed management, post-harvest handling, etc. So if you're interested in registering for that, I can drop a link in the chat after I'm done with this little introduction. We're also working on a benchmarking study right now, so you can get paid to share your financial records with us. We're recruiting small-scale veg, flower, and herb farmers that have 2+ years of growing experience to participate in this benchmarking study. The purposes of the study are to help producers improve their farm business management and record-keeping practices, compare their performance against producers at similar scales and enterprises, and also to develop strategies to increase profitability. And if you're interested in partaking in this benchmarking study, you can contact me at emilyround@tufts.edu, or also just drop your email address in the chat and I will send you an email with more information later. So if you're interested in that, definitely drop your email in the chat and I will send you some more stuff because it's a pretty fun research study that we're doing. New Entry has a YouTube channel if you'd like to take a tour of the New Entry campus and farm site. You can go to that YouTube channel and click on the New Entry virtual tour. This workshop is part of a series of workshops on record keeping and climate resiliency. This is, I believe, the 4th one out of 6. The next 2 coming up are on point of sale market data collection and market channel risk assessment, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. We will give you some information to register for those workshops after this one. All the resources from these workshops can be found on our website. If you go to the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project website and go navigate to the resources and then to the Farmer Resource Library and then to the Climate Recordkeeping tab, you'll see all of the resources from the previous workshops, including recordings from those workshops, the slideshows from those workshops, and also some one-page fact sheets from those workshops, which are very helpful. And as we like to say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. This workshop is funded by grants, which is why it's free. And we just ask that you fill out a survey before and after the workshop. I'm going to add the workshop survey for this one now. Filling these surveys and polls out help us a ton because it makes our funders happy, for one, which is great. We'd love to keep our funders happy. It lets us know if our workshops are effective, if they're actually helping anyone, and how we can change them to help serve you all better. So you'll see a poll coming up now. Please fill it out. It will make me so happy, and another puppy will earn its dog wings or something like that if you fill it out. And there will be a survey that pops up after the workshop as well. These surveys are much more helpful if we can get an idea of what you know before the workshop and after the workshop. So if you can pretty please fill out the survey afterwards. We make them very, very quick. So you should be able to just, within 5 minutes, click a couple things and give us a ton of information that we find very helpful. Tonight we're hearing from Kian, who is a wonderful person and a great farmer and a financial record keeping and other financial things expert. Or maybe, I don't know if you want to call yourself an expert or not, Kian, but I'm going to call you an expert tonight. And he can tell you a bit more about himself as he starts his workshop or starts his section of the workshop. And we would just want to thank our funder, Northeast Extension, Risk Management Education, and the USDA. So thank you to them. And also thanks to all of you for coming to this workshop. Thank you for coming. I hope you guys get to learn a lot and enjoy. So Kian, if you'd like, you can share your screen and we can start learning some fun stuff.
You're on mute, Kian.
So in addition to that, calling me an expert, and the first thing I did to try to clear my screen may have stopped your poll early. So I want to make sure that you got the data you need, and that if you didn't, that you can get the data you need.
The poll is still going as far as I can tell.
Okay. So this is an interesting setup for me because usually we have kind of one topic during any one of these, and tonight we kind of have three. And so it's going to feel a little bit disjointed, I think. I'm going to have a couple of moments to pause. I'm going to encourage you to write down your questions so that, especially because we do have a recording for the session, you may not want to jump up and ask your question with the recording going, and that's totally fine. You can use the chat box. You can, if you want someone else to voice something for you in a moment, you can have that as a direct message to Jeff Cole, who is working with the CARE project, and so is my plant in this room tonight. The CARE project is an organization that I hope a lot of you have heard of. We work in New England, except for the most part in Vermont, mostly in southern New England. And realistically, what we're doing is trying to provide support for the behind the scenes things, a lot like New Entry, to be able to support farmers being profitable and staying in agriculture, and farms staying in agriculture. And that's working with business advisors, doing workshops like this, as well as advocacy and research. I'm gonna skip that because you've already met me.
Just to interrupt you really quick, Kian.
Yeah.
That did close out the poll before, and for me to reopen the poll, I had to clear out the other questions. So if you already answered the poll, I'm very sorry. Please fill it out again. And sorry for my technical blunder. And thank you so much for filling out the poll twice if you are now filling it out twice. Thank you.
Sorry, it's entirely my fault. But it's an evening. I think people are perhaps understanding of that we are not necessarily as awake as we would like to be, and not as perfect at these things as we'd like to be at this time of day. So today we're going to finish out the conversation that we started. And if you weren't with us, that you can watch a video about that we did in December on scenario planning. And that part is sensitivity analysis, but I tricked everyone by putting it to the end. We're going to also talk about competitive analysis, but realistically, to be able to do those things and kind of bring us all back together to having these kinds of conversations, we're going to start by talking a little bit about goals. I know that sounds a little bit less solid than I'm often known for in terms of talking to folks about numbers, but bear with me. I think that it's really relevant and can be helpful as you move forward with your numbers. So generally speaking, if you have a business plan, or if you're writing a business plan, or if you're thinking about writing a business plan, there's usually a goals and future plan section. There's some place for you to, solidify, write down, and then be able to share with other people, including potentially people who might be giving you money or giving you a grant, loaning you some money. Those goals are usually broken out into a 1, 3, and 5-year timeline. Even if you haven't written a business plan, if you're not there yet, or if you need to update your business plan because it's maybe a little out of date, the idea of spacing out the goals and planning incremental steps is really important. And when we talk about some of the things we're going to talk about today, keeping that in mind, that figuring out where you want to be is part of this, figuring out where you are now and where you want to be, and then trying to figure out what the steps are that are going to get you in that direction. So realistically, you're looking to figure out how to put yourself in a better position to move closer to the next goal, whether that's direct or slightly sideways. And part of that for most of our businesses really is figuring out how to adapt to a changing environment as we're looking toward longevity for our businesses. And it doesn't look like this, but it does feel like it sometimes. No 5-year plan should look like this, but I have worked with enough people to know that a lot of businesses' 5 years plans look an awful lot like this. All of this stuff has to get done. It'll all get done in the next 5 years. I don't know. When I'm thinking about it, I want to be more specific and be really intentional about how I'm making. So I think about goals as being RAMs. They have to be realistic, achievable, measurable, and specific. And this isn't just for a workshop. I actually recited this list of 4 things this morning for a client who we were working on her business plan. And there was this moment where there was a goal, and I was like, I don't think that's a goal, because is this measurable? How are you going to decide if you actually made this goal? And thinking about these things, I've heard some people add a particular timeline to them, but because of the variability, especially the variability in climate, I like to leave that a little bit less solid in agriculture than maybe people in other industries do. So I think of goals as RAMs: realistic, achievable, measurable, and specific. And anytime I'm thinking about, do I want to do this for my business, to figure out whether or not I can really have it as a goal and set a specific benchmark for myself, that's what I'm thinking about. Is it realistic? Is it actually something I can achieve? Or is it realistic for someone else's farm, but not for mine, based on the resources I have available or whatever else is going on for my specific business? And then how am I going to measure it? How am I going to know if I got to the goal or how close I got to the goal? So when I break those out, when I'm working with clients or for my own business, I'm thinking about them in different categories and on different timelines. The categories are usually production, how much of what I'm going to be growing, systems and operational, which might be things like updating food safety or handling stuff on your farm, or it might be keeping track of your seeding chart better. Sometime in July last year, maybe it got a little fuzzy as to whether or not you were seeding things on the date you expected to. It might be your financial things. Financial goals are really important, and that can be revenue goals. It can be net goals. It can be how much you're paying yourself kind of goals. It could be the percentage you do or don't want to be spending. It might be just lowering the fees that you're paying to banks. I worked with someone whose goal was to not pay as much in overdraft fees. I think that's an amazing goal. That's a really important goal. You recognize where you're at and you give yourself an incremental step. You're not saying I'm going to make it all completely better. You're saying this is a realistic, achievable thing for me to do next year. And in a couple of years, I won't be paying any of those fees. And they're also personal goals. And we often forget about that when we're thinking about our businesses as business owners. But it's really important, especially if we have small businesses, to be considering what those personal goals are. They really inform the other goal setting. So when you're thinking about financial goals, how much money does your business need to be putting into your household? And that's going to be very different for different people. That might be zero for some people, and it might be $100,000 for other people. And there's really no way to assess numbers without having that kind of sense of what your household needs are. And then that timeline, spreading them out, not trying to do them all at once. So we had an example farm that we talked about in December, I think actually November and December, and their goal was to build a new wash station in 2024. And we went through some numbers related to that and doing some projections for that. So if they're building something in 2024, the actual building, the construction project, is something they want to do. That's a goal. It has, it has an end point. You can say the roof is up, the walls are closed, we can be safe working in here, the wash station is done. And then when to pay for it, because that's not necessarily something that's happening on the same timeline, right? There's longer period of time to pay for it. And related to that, there are expected increases in revenue, and they're incremental, giving yourself time, not just we're going to make more money, but what do those steps look like? And that also includes operational things like cover crops being added to a crop rotation, which I've done on my own farm. The more land we have, the more capacity we have to rest things. And so that changes how the crop rotation works. And that can always include things about employees if you have them. And I'm always really specific with my clients about that applying for a grant is a really good goal. Getting the grant is outside of your control, so it's not really a good goal, right? How can you decide whether you have achieved what you could do if it's in someone else's hands? So figuring out what those kinds of goals are and how to space them out so that you're not trying to do 8 very big, important, and time-consuming projects all at the same time. When we set these goals, because they're measurable and specific, we then have to figure out what we need to measure to be able to decide whether or not we reached our goals. So to do that, when we're looking to do a financial goal like increasing revenue, we're really recording revenue, right? Really straightforward. It's a little less straightforward for some other things. If your goal is to have a certain dollar amount of net with a new enterprise, you're going to be looking for enterprise specific financial record keeping, which is more complicated. And then the question becomes, can you keep this up? How do you do this? How do you make it easy for yourself to do it so that it is clear to you if you've reached your goal? And then there's always the question of things like staffing. You have to track the hours in some way. Sometimes that can be kind of estimated, and sometimes it's not really great at being able to be estimated, and you have to make sure you're writing things down all the way through the year. I really like the goal of farmers taking a day off per week. I was talking to someone about that this week, where the idea of basically every one of the owners in this multi-owner business is going to pick a Sabbath. They're going to decide and assign themselves a day of rest for their own bodies and peace of mind. And then the other one is going to record them taking the time off. And making sure because they are not being very good at being accountable to themselves for taking care of themselves, but neither of the business partners wants the other one to burn out. So they're going to support each other in reaching that goal of having a day off every week for each of them. So I'm going to pause and look at the chat. This is largely for me if anybody has specific questions. And now we're going to kind of consider that goals are part of all of the next things that we're going to be looking at. And one of those is really figuring out how to pricing structure. And so creating a pricing structure, and the tool itself is the competitive analysis. The idea of a pricing structure is a little bit larger than that. So a strategy and a structure is creating a system for something and documenting what you've created. So it's not just saying these are the prices, this is my price list, because that's a snapshot of what you have now, and it's not the reasons for things, and it's not giving you the opportunity to be able to update something. If you look at that price list again, you kind of have to start over to update information. So the idea of creating a system for yourself and including what your reasoning is. That way, as things change, you can make those adjustments instead of reinventing everything that you've done. And it allows you to use the framing of the information you already have to really get those decisions that you need faster and with more confidence. So again, the price list is not the same as the price strategy. And you probably will only have one price strategy, but you may actually have multiple price lists, whether that's wholesale and retail, or I've worked with people who go to different markets, and the markets that are further away have a higher price list than the ones that are nearby, or the markets that are in higher socioeconomic areas have higher prices than the ones that are in lower socioeconomic areas, because they know that they can get those prices there. And they did this kind of analysis to really figure that out. So if you're going to be looking at setting up a pricing structure for your business, for each part of that, you're going to be looking at this kind of gradient. So there's no one right price, right? You need to know that you're not losing money. You need to know that you're clearing your costs of production, which is over on the left, that you're really clearing the overhead and desired contribution that you have for that item, and then that you're not pricing yourself out of the market, which is all the way on the right. To do that, we're looking to figure out your cost of production, your break-even point by unit, the prices in your market, and the highest priced competitor. The prices in your market and highest priced competitor are the part that are really in the tool of the competitive analysis. The other two are things that you have to calculate. They're specific to your farm. They're not part of this tool, but they inform them. The tool itself, the competitive analysis, is really determining the market, the range of pricing within that market, and what the competition looks like in that market. It gives you that limited range of where you'll be able to price and clear all of your costs without pricing yourself out of the market. This is typically done by item, and that makes it a little bit more challenging for those of us who have a lot of items. But you're taking one item and looking really specifically at it, and what you're really doing is trying to figure out how to compare all of the different things in the market. So you're adding a perceived value based on the numbers you can get from your competitors in the market, and then trying to kind of pretend they all have the same values, all of the items. And we'll look at that a little bit more in detail. When you're looking at anything like this, you have to select a specific item. So you're not going to be trying to do all of your carrots at the same time. You're not going to be trying to do any kind of chicken and cuts of chicken at the same time. If you're looking at whole animal beef prices, it's a couple of dollars a pound, versus if you're looking at steaks high end, you're going up to $30 to $40 a pound for some of them. So looking at all of them at the same time is kind of too much for this level of detail. But if you have specific key items, whether those are things that you sell a lot of, or there's something that's kind of foundational to your marketing, something that you want to sell more of, if you're increasing or planning to increase your sales of a particular thing, it's a really good time to figure out whether you're going to be really getting the added profitability for your business that you're hoping those added sales are going to give you. So when you're trying to figure out all of this stuff, before you really get into that competitive analysis, you need to figure out your cost of production. We already looked at this a little bit. We want to look at our own cost of production, not pretend that we can understand everybody else's cost of production, because it really does feel sometimes like it just keeps going and it goes down to zero. In, I don't know, California, perhaps large farms elsewhere in the country, it seems that their costs of production are so dramatically different than ours that we can kind of get caught up in it, and it doesn't help us. So the lowest end here is really your own cost of production. And we went over this a little bit in a little more detail a few months ago, but the idea of figuring out how much it costs to get the crops in the ground by acre or by row, which includes supplies and labor expenses, because labor is a really big percentage. And if you aren't paying yourself, considering what it would cost to pay other people to do this, because if you were to, say, get larger as a business and have to start paying employees, and if you are 100% of the labor and you're considering your labor as being free, when you're not considering the cost of the labor expenses that you would be incurring if you were paying someone, then planting twice as much of it and having to hire somebody means that you are now losing money, because you haven't taken into account that you can't just work twice as hard. And then you're also taking all those costs of getting stuff out of the ground, packaging, labor, harvesting, and packing. If you have something that is going to require that you are doing delivery on it, the delivery may be part of that you're trying to figure out how to get it all the way to the market. We looked at squash last time, and we looked at how to look. Yes.
I had someone send me a message that they couldn't see your screen. Is there anybody else who can't see your screen right now? Or is that let's see. Okay. It looks like everyone can see
Okay.
it, so I think it might just be something for one person, and I will try to troubleshoot with them what it is. Okay. Thank you for letting me interject.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's one person having trouble seeing the screen and hearing the speakers. Um, let's see. I'll poke around at some of the settings and see if I can figure this out for the two people having some issues with the screen. But so
Okay.
you can continue on and I will do some fiddling.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Keep me posted. So sorry. Figuring out how to get the squash into the ground, we're looking at what it costs by planting typically, right? You're not just considering what it costs to get one plant into the ground. You're looking at however many hundreds of plants you're putting at a time. And then you can figure out what that cost is per case only when you know how many cases you've had. So it ends up being taking those records over time, figuring out all of the costs related to things going into the ground, things coming out of the ground, and also getting that salable cases, which in this case was 36, and the cost per pound, so that we then have a unit that we can work with. We actually have 2 units here because we have cost per case and cost per pound. So I want to point out that this kind of math doesn't necessarily account for the delivery costs or selling costs. If you need to keep those involved with any of these pricing, if you're taking one thing to one market, that might be something that you want to take into account. And if you're doing this for an entire enterprise or it's for, say, CSA, and that's really part of it for you to be able to get it to market, considering that as part of the costs is a really reasonable thing to do. So when you're doing that, this is just a kind of bringing all that information together. All the costs related go in the same place, right? We're putting all of those costs, we're recording all of those costs, we're being specific about what the data is that we're putting together. That's the proper way to do it. That's ideal. For a lot of us, that's impossible. So estimating is really a good way to get slightly fuzzy numbers, to get that kind of information close enough to know that you can clear your cost of production. And if you're not sure how fuzzy those numbers are, you can always build in a little bit of buffer when you're setting prices and say, okay, well, I think it cost about this much. I'm going to round it up to the nearest $5 per case or the nearest dollar, whatever is going to make you feel like you've really cleared that cost that you may not have perfectly accounted for. And then also lets us do things like, for those of us with row crops, it takes about the same amount of labor and about the same amount of time and about the same amount of effort for a lot of different crops that are planted on the same pattern. So that might be that you aren't accounting for a difference between different kinds of cucurbits, or all of your pumpkins and winter squash have a lot of the same data being used. You might be using one thing for bunched greens because they're all pretty close. They're close enough. And cabbage in terms of what those costs are. So figuring out how to get reasonably close to the technically correct data collection without the level of time and effort that is required to get perfect details is a really important step, because one of the things that we really want to focus on is getting some numbers in place, and then you can update those numbers and make them more detailed over time or the next time you go around to do this. But no matter what we do, the first time we do something like this, it's often going to be imperfect. And so recognizing that and figuring out how to get some information and move us in the direction of getting the right kind of pricing structure in place is better than kind of getting stuck. And it's a lot better for a lot of us. Approximating is as close as a lot of farms need to be able to really know that they're clearing their expenses. And again, there's a big difference between owner's labor, which we talk about in terms of figuring out your cost of production, and the owner's draw, which is something that's specifically how much you're paying yourself. Owner's labor is figuring out it's really just for figuring out your cost of production or figuring out how much it's going to cost for you to replace your labor with paid labor. It's a really good tool for that as well. If you're trying to figure out how much it's going to cost to take on employees and how many employees you need, it allows you to estimate time and estimate replacement pay. So it has nothing to do with how much you are or are not paying yourself at any given time. Just to highlight that, owner's labor, necessary for what we're doing today. Owner's draw, we're going to ignore this for now. It's important in general. Please try to pay yourself, but it's not part of our math tonight. So we have the cost of production. We know that the next step is to try to figure out that point in the middle, but where that point in the middle is kind of fiddly to try to figure out. So it's kind of a break even, but it's specific for the pricing. So it's ends up being a little bit different in terms of the information that you need than when you're doing it for your whole farm or for your enterprise. It's really about this item. So how much does this item need to put in toward making the farm run? So I use the term net contribution for this. It's something I picked up from my years in retail, where each of the departments in a department store or in a store with multiple departments is expected to contribute to the net of the store. That's where it comes from. It is not necessarily the perfect accounting term, but desired profit also has no specific accounting purpose. So we're just going to use the term that makes sense for our conversation. So the idea of figuring out how much this particular crop needs to have a net contribution. If you have a farm that is doing two things that take up about the same amount of space, you might have a really easy way to say, all right, that's going to be about half. I need whatever my expected costs are in terms of the overhead. The net contribution for this crop is going to be about half. But it's often not quite that simple. Figuring out what makes sense is going to be very farm specific and probably never going to feel perfect. But the idea of figuring out how much and just keeping in mind that you really want there to be a contribution to the farm from each item, and that things that you spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of land on probably should be paying more into the net contribution than I'm going to go with kohlrabi. Kohlrabi does not put much into the net contribution of probably anyone's farm, right? There may be one or two exceptions, but that's not really the focus for most of us. It's kind of a fun thing that people will stop at a farmer's market and go, the thing looks like Marvin the Martian, what is it? As opposed to something that we're really focusing on. So if it's something our farms are focusing on, we need them to be putting in more to the shared bank, the net contribution. And when you figure that out, you have to think about how much quantity you expect to sell of those items that you're trying to figure out the pricing for. So you don't have to worry specifically about the math on this, but the idea is that each unit sold has a contribution to make. So you can take the amount of the net contribution that you expect for all of the things, that are part of that has however many cases, and then the number of cases you expect to sell. So if you expect to grow and sell, and it's based on sales, right? You might grow 115 cases of summer squash, but if you're only going to sell 100 cases of summer squash, you have to use the 100. They have to cover all the costs, right? The extra cases, the damaged ones, the ones that are donated, they're wonderful. They're really good food. They're not paying the rent, and the 100 that sell have to pay the rent for everybody. So figuring out what that net contribution is overall for summer squash, and then deciding that if you expect it to be 100 cases, each one of those cases has to pay 1% of that total net contribution. So now we have the bottom end of that appropriate pricing range, and we need to figure out what that appropriate pricing range looks like. And this is when we get to go and do that competitive analysis. So we've finally gotten to the tool that you actually signed up for. You made it. This is a process that takes a little time to get set up for, but then does not take actually that much time when you're really putting the information in, thanks to smartphones. So for competitive analysis, the first thing is figure out who your competition is, listing each of the features and benefits for those items, assigning a value or a perceived value to each of those features or benefits based on the data that you have. So it's not just how much you think it might be. You have to look at trying to get the information you need from your competitors to fill in that information, and then adjust those numbers so that you can compare directly, determine where your current pricing is or is planned to be, and then figure out if that's really where your pricing should be or if it's time to make some adjustments. The first step in this is figuring out who your competition is. We often think about our competition as being similar business size and model. So another farm like mine that's family owned and grows vegetables and is selling within 10 or 20 miles of themselves, probably closer to 10, is probably going to be something that I would see as a more direct competitor. But similar product or perceived to be similar product from other places, including other farms, and share of plate product or replacement product. If they're not buying it from you, where are they buying it from? And we don't want to get lost in that completely. I've seen people who have been very frightened by the idea of having to consider all of the information on the internet. But the idea of figuring out who to include in this, you want a sample of people who are, or other businesses that are very similar to you, some that are a little less similar to you, and then some that are not necessarily a direct competitor. The same folks might not really be shopping with you and with them. And what that ends up looking like for a lot of us is figuring out what other farms and then what stores we can pull information from. And that less direct might be from those stores, which is the easiest way to get information, but it's important to include some from each of those categories. And then you go and get the information. Now you want to make sure that you're getting information enough to get the data you need to be able to complete the process. So that usually includes the price, the size of the product. Thankfully, if you're in a store setting, for most of us, aside from the flower farmers, there's a requirement with food now for the past few years in most Northeast states, if not nationally, that there's a price per unit. They're not always accurate, but in theory, there's a price tag on the shelf and it has a price per unit. So getting a picture with the price tag in it is really important. So price, size of the product, the store or farm, the town that it's in, and then its attributes and features. So if you're going into a store, you may be able to get a picture of the sign or the box and also the price tag, and that's going to give you the information you need. And if you're going to do a bunch of these at the same time, taking a picture on the way into the store of the name of the store gives you that information. It's a little harder with farms, especially because I think most of us feel a little bit awkward about taking pictures at someone else's farm stand or snooping. It feels a little bit like snooping. But I do want to specify that this is actually an accepted practice for stores. So if you think about, as a vegetable farmer or for the clients that I've worked with who have food products, and I actually for folks who are doing non-food items and flowers as well, personal care items, what happens in terms of retail environments is that someone is going from one store to another store within a certain radius, or however many stores are in a certain radius that their bosses have decided are their direct competition, and getting this information about the products, their key products from that store as well. I've actually seen people walking around with clipboards, but now everyone seems to have switched to smartphones, which is much more subtle. And also, you just look like you have a shopping list that was sent to you by a spouse, typically. You're looking at the phone and looking at the shelf and looking at the phone and looking at the shelf, and no one thinks anything of it. So you get to be a spy for a little while, pull this information together, and then you can kind of list out all of this information in a spreadsheet. When you put it into a spreadsheet, it might seem a little overwhelming. This is an anonymized version, but it's one that I did a couple of years ago for a client. And the idea is trying to figure out how to get the information you need in a way that's comparable. So this is those boxes of greens that there's like a wall of them in every produce department at this point. And the farms are not part of those walls of greens. Those are from farmers markets. And then all the other ones are from those grocery stores. This person happens to be farming in a fairly densely populated area. And so there were a lot of store options. He didn't want to try to put all of them in there, but putting in a few from each of the stores seemed really important. And the closest store to him, and in terms of the less indirect competition, was Whole Foods in his mind. So we used that information pretty strong. So what we ended up doing was pulling information like, is it local? Is it organic? Is it sustainable? And is it hydroponic? And for something like that wall of greens, it's pretty easy to see what those potentially perceived increased or values are, right? Because you can stand in front of a whole bunch of boxes that have the same information at the front, and you can see what are the kind of words that they put in those little starbursts on the front, right? What's the thing they want the customer to see first and think that the customer is going to pick up their product because of? So those are often the perceived values. These are not the only perceived values there are. One of them for a lot of folks is being able to know the farmer, depending on if that's a concern. And I've seen ones that have what kind of soil is being used. Are you using certified organic soil or not? Are you in New York, there's something that's called farmers. Oh man, I'm now blanking. I believe it's Farmers Promise, Farmers Pledge or something. And the idea is that it's someone saying that they're growing using the USDA certified organic rule book without certifying. But there's a specific name for that. And so that's something that you'll see on things or on people's signs at a farmer's market. So we take the information, and the information that we got from going to these stores was really just prices, ounces, and value, or perceived value items, local, organic, sustainable, and hydroponic. Because each of those clamshells is a different size, we want to get a price per pound so that we can actually directly compare them. And because some of these are actually arugula, and some of them are blends of greens, and some of them are just lettuce, but they're priced the same way, we're going to pretend that they're all one item. And realistically, figuring out what that looks like from a cost of production standpoint is a little different. You get different yields from different things. But in terms of the pricing, they're going to line up a lot more closely, because that's what the market does with these. It's called line pricing. That's what the market does with this stuff. So we got a price per pound on everything so that we could compare directly. And then we tried to figure out what that price difference is by perceived value. So we were looking to get a difference between whether there is a price difference with stuff that's organic or not certified organic, and stuff that was local or not local. What we ended up doing was figuring out that it was about $1. It was 70 cents somewhere. It was $1.50 somewhere else. There was more information that I pulled so that it wasn't just a giant wall of data. And the idea of trying to figure out what is already being paid in your market for the values that your product already has. Or if your product doesn't have those things, if you're not certified organic and they're not certified organic, you're already on that level. But then for the organic items, you would want to subtract that dollar that we assign to it based on figuring out an average, so that they are on the same level that you are. So feels a little bit wonky, but once you do it a couple of times, it ends up making a lot of sense. So then you have a price per pound, an adjusted price per pound. And that adjusted price per pound is really what you're trying to figure out in terms of where you stack in your marketplace. So we've done all of these things, right? We've listed everything out, figured out the list of competitors, got that information, listed out the features and benefits, figured out the perceived value, which in this case we assigned to the dollar. Please don't use these numbers for your own farms, by the way. The information is a couple of years old. It is from a very specific location. It does not apply to everybody's businesses, both in terms of timeline and in terms of pricing. So it's important to do this process yourself. But if you and a couple of friends are in a similar situation and you're doing this together, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. Just trying to make sure that your information is current and relevant. So then you're looking at everything so you can compare directly, figuring out where you are or plan to be in terms of pricing and where it should be. So if you're figuring out where your pricing is, if you're all the way at the top, somebody's got to be there. There is no reason why you can't be the price all the way at the top if you can command the price all the way at the top of your market. If you have the product, if you have the marketing, if you have the confidence, you can be the price at the top. I've known some of those folks, and if the product is there, they can maintain it, and it's a great place to be in a marketplace. And if you're all the way at the bottom of the pricing and you like that about the way where your pricing is, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong there either. If you are clearing your costs, if you are putting that net contribution in, if you're getting what you need to out of your business financially, there's nothing wrong with your pricing if you're toward the bottom. But to be able to thrive with the low dollars per pound on greens, you have to have a lot of sales, which means you need a really efficient production. So your cost of production is really low as a percentage of revenue to be able to do that. You have to have a lot of turns to be able to make the kind of money you need to be able to pay all of your bills if you are planning on being toward the bottom. All right, so we figured these things out.
Ian, if I can interject, we have a question that's probably timely, and it is, how often do you recommend doing a competition analysis? They're conjecturing that cost of production or break even should be reviewed at least annually, but what about this?
I think that it depends on how many of these you're doing, because you can really, and they're best done by item. So it depends on how many items you have. If you have, 3 or 4 items that you're really focusing on your farm, you could do this kind of level of detail every year. I will say that once you know who your competition is, being able to check on prices becomes much easier. If you've done this once for something, going in and updating the pricing is much, much easier. I do it every year for my CSA in terms of the other CSAs in our area, which is, by week. It's a price per week. Sometimes I've looked at it as price per person per week based on the aim of the number of people the farm tells you that their CSA is supposed to feed. Because it really dramatically changes things. But because that's one item, the CSA is one item, it's pretty easy to update that information by checking people's websites around January, February. But in terms of doing that for a very diversified farm, that may be just a lot of time that people don't have to be able to do that. So figuring out what that is for certain key items, the higher volume items, or if you have a new enterprise and you're going to have a couple of key items in it, that's a really good time to focus that information in. Otherwise, if you do a number of these over time and you update them periodically, so you may rotate them. You may do one enterprise each year, every third year, or whatever makes sense for you to figure out how to get the data you need. But if you have specific questions and want to get set up with help doing this for your own business, you can email Jeff Cole and he will get you set up, or Emily Round, and they can get you set up with someone who can sit down with you and do your own numbers, because these are so individualized. And if you have, for instance, that farm that I mentioned earlier that was going to a further away market and pricing for very differently for the different markets, they had a different price list. They could arguably do a different appropriate pricing range for any item in each of their markets, which might ultimately be why they mostly sell at the New York City farmers markets now, because they could get twice as much money for the same thing. The idea of figuring out what this market looks like is very specific. So it's a lot of data, or potentially a lot of data, and so it's how much you need without drowning, I think, is ultimately the most concise answer to that. It was a good timing for that question. So just as a reminder, there are a lot of numbers going into something like that. The numbers are important. Fuzzy numbers are better than no numbers, but the numbers are important. And for a competition, for doing a really good competitive analysis, it does tend to feel like a lot of data. If you love a good spreadsheet and you're good at them, have at it. It's really straightforward. Once you kind of put the pieces together, you'll be able to see it. If you're not so confident in your spreadsheeting abilities and you need some support with that, there's support out there. I love a good spreadsheet. And there are a lot of other people who do too. And then the third section that we want to go through today is sensitivity analysis. So as we kind of moved through stuff with the other things, Jeff and I were talking last week about how these things connect to each other. So I'm going to try to make that connections, but if I don't, I want people to ask about it at the end, right? If you don't understand the connection between goal setting, competition or competitive analysis and pricing structure and sensitivity analysis by the end of our time together this evening, make me explain it to you because I did something wrong, okay? So in December, we did most of the scenario planning process. So we started at the top and went all the way through. We reviewed historical financials. We looked at the project financial or projected financials for the business and enterprise as it is with no changes. Talked about one change, and then we're looking at the sensitivity of what that smaller range of possibilities is based on the projections we already have. So we're looking at a method of studying various sources of uncertainty in a mathematical model with multiple variables, which means nothing to most of the time. Realistically, what it is we're trying to determine the impact on the whole enterprise or business that variables have. People call it a what if analysis, but I think that what if analysis makes it sound really hard on the brain. I think it makes it sound like you're thinking of all of the things. What you're really trying to do is try to rein that in. What happens if revenues are a little lower, direct operating costs are a bit higher, labor costs go up, a bigger loan or longer payback period is required for what you want to do? So figuring out really what those reasonable ranges are of variables, and then when it still does or doesn't make business sense to do something. So we're not looking at all of this. This is all of the storms from a period of a number of years. We're not looking at all of this. That's too much. This is your entire to-do list for your business. We're looking at this. What are we looking? Where are we now? What changes do we expect in this period of time? It's typically a year of it you're looking forward for these kinds of projections. And instead of just one line, we're looking at a cone, right? What's the range of places that we might end up? So there are 3 columns of data. There's the conservative, regular, and optimistic projections. And the easiest way to do this is put it into a spreadsheet so that the software does the heavy lifting. I don't like trying to play in spreadsheets during these workshops. I think that it makes it really hard to follow. So if you need help with something like this for your own businesses, because some of you have already been doing the earlier steps and doing scenario planning, this is just an additional piece. And if you need help with setting up your spreadsheets for this, email Emily or Jeff or both of them, and we'll get you set up with some support to do that. For our made-up farm that I made up and I made up all the numbers for, this is what that looked like. These are the same numbers we looked at the last time that we were together, and just kind of giving us the sense of what changes there might be. So some of those changes are that with the regular projections, we're looking at $180,000 in revenue. We're looking at a little over half, 53% of that going to variable expenses, another $48,500 going to fixed costs. And then the plan is to pay the owner to pay himself $20,000. Is that enough? No. Is that more than many farmers make from their businesses? Yes. So this is the number that we put in. Please don't plan for that to be your number. Figure out what you need. But the idea of figuring out, okay, if things go a bit awry with a conservative year, if there's another year that maybe goes rough in terms of the impacts of weather, or if there's just fewer CSA members sign up, if something goes awry a bit, what might that look like? And so thinking about that, I was like, okay, well, maybe that's $165,000. And then what if the variable expenses are not really going down as much as one would hope, right? The revenue goes down, variable expenses will probably go down because you won't need as many people for as many hours. You can perhaps keep fewer people employed further into the fall, or whatever it is to reduce those variable expenses. But as a percentage of revenue, they may still be up a bit. So the percentage of revenue in a conservative year, and your projection thinking that things are going to go awry a little bit, maybe that's closer to 54%. The fixed costs might be up a little bit. Maybe there's, occupancy costs go up a little bit. There's some administrative costs that you didn't plan for, but you still think you could be able to pay yourself $20,000, and that gives you a regular net of $6,500. It's not where you wanted it to be, but it's still above zero. You still paid yourself. You paid your staff members. That doesn't feel so bad for many of us, right? Looking at those numbers. And then if things go really well, right, that wash station project you have gets finished early. And so you can increase the amount of money that you're making. Few extra people sign up for the CSA. Your wholesale is able to go up because you have better storage in the fall. All right, well, then you'd still expect to have the dollar amount of your variable expenses go up, but the percentage of revenue goes down a bit, right? So make any one of those dollars, you're spending money to be able to pay the staff members and the seeds going into it in the soil and the repairs that you have to make on the tractor because you have used it more. So you're still spending the dollars, but as a percentage of revenue, it goes down. And you don't really expect that you're going to get free rent out of the deal. So even in an optimistic year, you're still expecting to pay about the same amount for fixed costs. So the regular net then ends up being $26,000. So it's not exactly, but it's about a $10,000 difference in terms of net that you might expect with this scale of farm, this type of farm, going from things going a bit awry to the regular projections, and then the $10,000 from the regular projections to a really good year. But the whole point of this was to be able to fund a construction project. So now that we know that there's there's this range that goes, from that center line where you expect things to be up or down about $10,000 in either direction. Then you can think about, okay, well, how does that affect the project that I have? I have this construction project. I expect it's going to cost about $50,000 for the construction itself, about $8,000 for the electrical updates, and permits, maybe $500. You got that information from the town, so you don't expect the $500 to be really any different. But of course, with electrical stuff, it might cost a little bit more. Construction projects might take a little bit longer. And so the idea, especially if it's the kind of year where construction gets delayed, like it might have last year in terms of how long and when things can be going into the ground, that can make a big difference in terms of that the impact it feels, how long it takes, when you feel like you can start paying that kind of project back. So considering what that timeline looks like is important. So it's not just what does this look like on paper, but how is this going to feel for us? And for this farm, for these projections, looking at that difference, that range that we have of between it being, $6,500 as a regular net, and then that's where they would be trying to reduce the ongoing costs from. That's how they're going to be paying back the loan that they're getting to do this construction project. Or, in a good year, it might be a $20,000 difference almost for how much money they'd be able to pay that down with. So figuring out not just what that looks like, but how it feels and how long it's going to take, right? So there's that point where you're looking at all the numbers. There are a bunch of numbers in there. You've done the sensitivity analysis itself in terms of what do those numbers look like. And then the next part is really having that discussion of options and scenarios. And we often kind of breeze over those when it comes to these kinds of conversations, because we can't have that conversation right now, right? There's not enough time. It's impossible to do that kind of thing over Zoom. But if you're putting that kind of money into a construction project, it's probable that you have someone else who you're using to, bounce ideas off of. You might have a farm manager or somebody you have as a key person who helps you make decisions. You might have a partner in your business, or a forgiving spouse who has not had a problem with you farming for so long. Whatever that looks like for you, so that you have someone to talk to about those options and scenarios, maybe before you talk to an accountant about what that would look like in terms of your loan itself, to figure out what makes the most sense for your business. And it's possible that you might decide that things don't make sense. Maybe this isn't the right year for a project. Maybe the project should wait. Maybe you know that this is a potential impact, and so what you really want to do is see if you can find a grant to be able to help with that process, to cover some of those costs, so that it's really less of a potential negative impact for you to see that. Emily is volunteering to have these conversations with anyone, which is great. Please take her up on it. She's great to have conversations with, all kinds of really important kind of alternate scenarios that they might be able to point out for you. So that gives you, those conversations really give you kind of the framing of what's going to make sense for your business. And when we think about those, we can go back to those goals, right? We set goals. We want to be able to build those goals into this. Does this kind of project, does this big change that we want to make to our business impact our goals, and how? Does it make it so that we're more likely to reach those goals in years 3 and 5? Or does it mean that we're going to not make any of our goals in year 1 because it's going to take over all of year 1? Trying to figure out what those things are is part of that conversation. And we have those conversations. Things that aren't goals are also important. You have desires for your business. You can't really set climate resilience as a goal, because what does that mean, right? You have to be more specific than that. But the idea of building resilience into your business, climate resilience and financial resilience, really is necessarily part of those conversations, right? You want to make sure that you're moving those directions, and they're not goal specific, but they are informing how you make decisions and how you run your business. You might have ROI as return on investment. I try not to use jargon, but return on investment I think is pretty common. The idea of when is this project paying back after it's paid for itself? What is it really giving us in terms of better or safer working conditions, and how important is that to our business? If you have a really high turnover rate for staff, and you don't think that they're going to come back if they have another year where it's freezing and wet and they're miserable, and they don't have safe, reasonable space for indoor working, that's a big concern. Staffing is a big problem. If you have good staff members and you want to keep them, you want to make sure that they have working conditions, not only that they deserve, but maybe are also a little cush compared to some of your competitors so that you can keep the good staff members. If it's going to make a difference in terms of the quality of your produce, that makes a difference in terms of lots of stuff, right? You can command a higher price for your produce if it's better quality potentially in your marketplace. You can't be that top line of your competition analysis. If you want to be farm A all the way at the top, you need to have that quality of produce. And if you can't do that without this project, you've really got to try to figure out if that's a priority you need to make, even if the numbers look like it might hurt a little bit for a little while. And then what kind of steps does it mean toward making your business more efficient over time? Big projects tend to make your business very inefficient for the time that the project is in process, right? Construction is a big pain in the butt. It destroys everything in terms of how you can think through your day. It changes where people can park. It changes how people interact with your business. It changes whether or not people know if they can shop. The number of times I've driven past someplace where it's like fixing barn, store still open, because they want to make sure that you're not just driving by. Otherwise, they're going to have an entire year with no revenue from their farm stand, right? So trying to figure out what those desires are and addressing those in these conversations as you make decisions is important. Addressing not just the goals that you have that are very concrete and measurable, but also a little bit more esoteric. I want to make a better business, be a better employer. There are specific things within that, but if you feel like you're not going to be moving in the direction of those desires, it might be really not a great time to do the project. And then there are always those concerns, right? How much labor is too much labor? If you have a big project, you have to have the right staff in place. If you don't have the right staff in place and you're looking at something that you're not confident is the right decision otherwise, that can make a really big difference in terms of how you make that decision. If you have off-farm income and you don't necessarily need the owner's draw, that might be something that you have as a conversation with your business partner and also maybe with a life partner, household management partner, in terms of figuring out if it is not a great year in terms of revenue for the farm, is your owner's draw something that you would want to put back in to pay for those costs? Is that even possible for you? And would you want to do that? And is that something to consider so that you have some it feels less risky, right? It's really a risk mitigation at that point. And then any debt concerns you might have. So when you're having those kinds of decision discussions, I don't want to encourage you to make the decision based solely on the numbers, because that's not how you run a business, right? You run a business as a human being with a staff, potentially with a life, and with personal and business finances. And the finances are really important framing, but they're not everything that you're doing, right? And so if you're making decisions based just on the numbers, it's a great way to burn out. Considering all of these things and using the numbers as your framing for whether or not a decision makes financial sense is really important. And it's more complex, but it makes for better decision making. So I really want to be able to try to get a lot of people to talk. So I'm doing this as a faster just from me video for today, and I want people to be able to talk about their own farms. So I'm hoping that people will want to talk now, but if you don't, that's okay. And we can do that as part of the question and answers after the video has stopped. We have someone in the chat box that's saying, the year I made major improvements to my retail space, I lost a lot in sales because my customers were. If we want to pause. With the phone.
Recording of the workshop, and Spiriday, your duck is adorable. So I'm very glad that they're joining us in the workshop tonight.
So as we go through these kinds of decisions for your own business and figuring out what makes sense in terms of framing for your business decisions, you really want to have what those goals are. Are your goals really goals? Are they realistic? Are they achievable? Are they measurable? Are they specific? Will you know if you reach them? Will you know that you got halfway there? How will you know? What do you need to record to be able to know how close you've gotten? Or how awesome you are at having met them 2 years before you expected to? And what are the next goals that you want to set for yourself? Because goals should be incremental. And then at what points would your business really benefit from doing a sensitivity analysis? especially if you're making big changes or planning big projects. It's a great time to do it. But sometimes you just need to kind of figure out where you're at. Do we want to put more money in terms of marketing into the CSA? Do we want to put more money in terms of marketing into wholesale? Where do we want to focus our attention? What's going to be the best thing for our business? That's a great time to consider doing a sensitivity analysis. If you haven't done projections for the year, I encourage you to start there. And if you want to know from having your regular projections what impacts certain decisions will make for your business, that next step is really more of a half a step. It's much easier to do once you get a really good sense of what those projections look like. And if you need help with those or anything else, you know how to get in touch with us. When you're looking at a competitive analysis, if you want to try to pull those numbers together, how do you know that those are accurate? Do you have the information you need? What products should you really focus on in terms of doing those competitive analyses, or the first ones, right? Because you don't want to try to do one for every item that you grow every year. It's probably just a lot of time. And then when would technical assistance help set your business up for success? And that's really important to me, both as a farmer and as someone who does technical assistance or business advising, trying to get the support you need at the right times to really leverage your business for success. That's one that I want you to think about. And if you don't know, if you're not sure if you're there or not, email Emily, email Jeff, because they can kind of guide you in the direction. If you're like, I'm not sure if this is the right time for me to get support, they'll ask you things like, what are your goals? Where do you want your business to be? Do you feel like you're there yet? And then we can talk about what the next steps might be in terms of things like setting goals and what kind of record keeping you might need to be able to get there. That's the end of our talk for this evening. This is information about the Carrot Project and the email for Jeff Cole, the client service coordinator at the Carrot Project. In general, questions can go to info. You might still get an email back from Jeff Cole. And if there are particular questions, you can email me, but also Emily Round at Tufts, who's our host for the evening. They'll answer all kinds of questions if you have them.
Hi, I just had